Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stephanie Ann again. I am your host, Stephanie, and I am here to talk about all things deconstruction, religious trauma, psychedelics, Jungian psychology, spiritual crisis, and basically just my process of discovering who I am again after a lifetime in Mormonism. I tend to be a very uncurated person, and so much of this podcast will be stream of consciousness style, where I share personal stories and experiences with the aim of creating personal, human-to-human connection rather than just sharing information. Thank you so much for being here. Let's go ahead and jump in. Okay, as I was sitting trying to figure out what I wanted to focus this episode on, I kept thinking about the experiences that I had in 2021, 2022, around that time with psychedelics, and when I entered my full-blown spiritual crisis. And much of my process of going through a spiritual crisis had to do with, like I said, psychedelics, but also with leaving Mormonism and the way that Mormonism had sort of shaped my psyche, my conscious persona, and therefore all of my unconscious material. And so today's episode, I'm going to talk all about the experiences that I had during that time that connected me to my shadow for the first time in my life. And simultaneously, through this process of discovering the darkness within me, I was connected to humanity. I was connected to my own humanity and to just humanity in general. And how this is counterintuitive to what religion always taught me, as religion focuses so much on the light and the goodness and seeking heaven and seeking God, when what actually connected me to the deepest form of love that I had ever felt was encountering the opposite. It was the shadow. It was the darkness and the suffering and the pain. So I want to start by just describing a little bit what I was like when I was Mormon and kind of the state of mind that I was in when I was living in that environment. One of the things that I didn't realize when I was Mormon is that I was very disconnected from my own humanity. And I never would have said this at the time because it's not like I was not affected by other people's suffering. I definitely was. I remember there was a friend in high school who her little brother passed away, and there was another girl that I knew who her dad passed away. And I remember feeling a lot of pain for them. And, I would do what I could to help and, reach out or whatever because I felt a lot of empathy for them. And I remember being taught at church about how it's important to feed the poor and take care of the sick and all of that stuff. And obviously following the teachings of Jesus, the whole point, in theory, or at least the whole point is supposed to be compassion and empathy and taking care of each other. But religion has this way, especially Mormonism, of making you feel separate from the world. That's kind of the whole thing that Mormonism is based around, is this idea of we are different. We are in the world, but we are not of the world. We are a peculiar people is something that I would hear all the time growing up. And I remember feeling legitimately like I was separate. I would see people who were not Mormon, and I would feel this sense of I had something really special that they didn't have. And when you live with this sense of separateness or feeling like you're somehow not connected to the rest of humanity, it really affects your ability to feel true empathy. And this most likely didn't come just from being Mormon. It was probably a combination of being Mormon in a very homogenous area, combined with being part of the chosen or privileged demographic, that when you're a part of that, it's very easy to be disconnected from the suffering or whatever's happening on the rest of the planet because it doesn't ever quite seem to reach you. It always feels like it's out there, not in here. Combined also probably with my own blind spots, my own naivete, and coming from a long line of incredibly infantilized women. So all of that combined in my own life put me in a position that was very privileged, as well as growing up in an upper middle class area. And I didn't realize at the time that that's what was happening. But of course, when you're in some sort of position of privilege, it's very easy to ignore or to not necessarily connect with or to feel separate from the suffering in the world because, like I said, you're not being directly affected by it. And this was very much my experience. It didn't even dawn on me until after I left Mormonism that it was a privilege to be able to ignore what was happening in the world. I'm sure most people would love to ignore what's happening in the world. But if you're in a position where you can, you're very lucky, because many people do not have the option to ignore what is happening. So I lived in this sheltered, the image that I get is kind of like a snow globe. I picture my life as like a little Mormon snow globe fantasy reality. And a lot of times the empathy that I felt was based more on sameness. Like I mentioned, it was like someone at school who was going through something difficult, or someone who I went to church with. But then you were hearing messages at church about feeding people on the streets or giving them money. And the messages that you would hear were more like, you got to be careful with who you give your money to, because you never know what they're going to spend their money on. And you never know what they did to get themselves in that position. And we were never talking about global events at church. We were never talking about wars, unless it was from the position of we are America and we got to protect our God-given religious freedoms. Beyond that, there wasn't really a huge emphasis on connecting to the suffering on the planet, because so much of the narrative of Mormonism is that you are a chosen people, that you were more righteous in the pre-earth life before you came here. That's why you were born inside of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It was all of this messaging, this very dehumanizing messaging that seeps its way in underneath the surface and erodes your connection to your own humanity, while on the surface, it's being disguised as, we love Jesus. We're talking about Jesus. Jesus was compassion and service and all of those things. And this is really cringy, awful stuff to admit out loud. But I think it's important to speak to, because we can't really grow or evolve if we can't be honest with ourselves about where we've come from and who we have been. So this was the life that I lived. It kind of reminds me of the whole Charlie Kirk thing, which is obviously a very controversial topic. And personally, I have no need or desire to dehumanize him or anything like that. But the fact that there was so much outrage over his death, when in reality, if you look at it objectively, nothing about his death was uniquely immoral. There's deaths like that happening all the time. Parents being killed in front of their children. Children being killed in front of their parents. But as soon as it is somebody who feels like you, suddenly your empathy strings are being pulled on. That's how it was when I was Mormon. There was this unconscious disconnect from the rest of humanity because of all of the messaging that I had received. So my empathy strings were really only deeply pulled on when it was somebody who felt like me. It was based on sameness. And I remember when I left the church, it quite literally felt like I stepped over some sort of energetic threshold. Like, have you guys ever heard that quote that says, I feel like I just left Mormonism and joined the human race? That's how it felt. It felt like for the first time in my life, I was in the world. And during that time, like I mentioned, I was going through some really intense experiences. And I want to speak to this because these experiences are what connected me to my humanity in a very dramatic and sudden way. And this is going to get esoteric. When I was going through this process, it was the most traumatic thing I've ever been through, and I kept wanting some sort of like Western medicine answer of what was happening to me. I wanted to just go to a doctor and for him to give me a pill and to have this be explained. But nothing that I was going through ever lined up with anything that was that black and white. The process I was in was very existential, very spiritual. It had a lot to do with the unconscious, a lot to do with the collective unconscious and the shadow, and working through the spiritual layers of my being. So, like I mentioned, in 2021, I left Mormonism and I got divorced at the same time. And this happened after I did mushrooms. I had been researching mental health remedies because I wanted to get off of my antidepressant. And all of the research that I was doing about psychedelics for your mental health was really, really positive. The Western perspective narrative at that time, I don't really know what it is now, but at that time, they were kind of speaking to psychedelics as if they were nature's antidepressant. And I didn't know anything about how psychedelics actually worked. This was the messaging that I was getting, was basically just, these are really good for your brain. They're really good for PTSD. They're really good for anxiety and depression. Everybody needs to be doing these. And so I did research for quite some time. I had an experience with mushrooms when I was still Mormon for my mental health. I even told my bishop about it, made sure I was in the clear, and then very quickly deconstructed Mormonism and my marriage right after that. So I got divorced and left the church within like a 6-month period. It was very sudden and very traumatic. And then at the same time, I was diving into the world of psychedelics. And the way that I've had psychedelics explained to me now is that psychedelics are not a mental health remedy. They are an exploration of the soul. And when you are exploring the soul or the psyche, you have no idea what you're going to find in there. You're accessing the shadow. You're accessing the unconscious. That's where all your demons are. That's where everything that you don't want to look at is hiding. So I was just diving into psychedelics repeatedly. I was trying combo and 5-MeO-DMT and ayahuasca and going to space holders who didn't necessarily know what they were doing, who weren't pacing me at all or telling me otherwise. They were just giving me the green light, like, let's try again. Sure, let's try another one. Let's try another one. And the last psychedelic experience that I had in 2021, I went to someone who ended up mixing mushrooms and ayahuasca together. And after this experience, even though the experience itself was fine, it was like I was in the sky and I was communicating with angels and I saw crystals around me and whatever you do on psychedelics, whatever you do on mushrooms. Even though the experience itself was really great, afterwards, I entered some sort of psychosis, meaning I couldn't get back into my body. And I didn't know what was happening at the time. I didn't have the language to describe it. I just thought that I had fucked up my brain. I thought that something had gone very wrong, and I wasn't getting any integration. I was asking these people that I had been going to, like, what's happening to me? I feel like I'm not in my body. And one of them just said, you're stuck in the astral plane. That was her integration. And I was like, the hell is the astral plane? What? How do I get out of here? You know, how did I get here? And they didn't offer me anything besides that. So I spent a couple of weeks where I felt like a mad person. I remember looking at my hands and thinking they didn't look like my hands. I would touch the ground to make sure I was still in my body. I wrote frantically in my journal over and over and over. And if I look back on my journal during that time, it does look like the ramblings of a mad person where I'm like writing diagonally and horizontally and vertically and skipping pages and going back and forth. And it's impossible to read now because it doesn't make any sense. And I was also very, very panicked because I felt very disembodied. I felt like I was dissociating and I couldn't think clear thoughts. It was very, very destabilizing. So for a couple of weeks, it was really, really intense, and eventually it settled back down, and I started to feel somewhat okay. As okay as you can feel after doing a bunch of psychedelics, realizing that you're in a cult and getting divorced all at the same time. I at least felt like I could recognize my own hands and my own body. But then, not too long after that, I experienced my very first panic attack. I was at a party with my old Mormon friends. It was a Thanksgiving party. And at that point, I was starting to lose my friends as well. My best friends, people I was very close to, like travel the world with, have all our kids together, see each other multiple times a week, best friends. I was starting to lose them as well because I was talking about psychedelics all of a sudden, and I was saying things like, I don't believe in Judgment Day anymore. And have you ever thought about this about the church? And have you ever recognized these patterns of gaslighting? And so they were slowly starting to back up, and you could feel that it was like, oh, this is unsafe. This friend that we've had forever has now taken drugs, and something weird has happened in her brain. So they were slowly pulling away. But I was trying to be like, no, this is fine. I still belong here. I still fit in here. I can't lose my religion, my marriage, and all of my friends. I can't. And so I was at this party with them, trying to just make myself feel comfortable. And we're eating dinner, and I start getting cotton mouth. And I was very confused. I'd never had it before. I started to feel like I had maybe eaten something that I was having a reaction to. Was I getting sick? Was my mouth just really dry? Like, what was this? I put a cough drop in my mouth and it wasn't going away. I'm starting to feel really weird in my head. So I go into the bathroom and I'm starting to feel once again like I'm not in my body. I'm grabbing the walls around me, looking at my own skin, feels foreign to me. And I was having a ton of symptoms in my throat, a lot of throat and chest symptoms. So because I had never had a panic attack, I thought I was having a medical emergency. So I go back out there, I grab one of my friends, I tell him what's going on. He offers to drive me to the hospital. We're driving to the hospital. I'm having a full-blown panic attack at this point that I think is some sort of medical emergency. And by the time we get to the hospital, I've calmed down. I decide that I don't need to go in. I'm just like, okay, maybe I need to just go home and sleep or whatever. And from that day forward, it was almost as if a flip got switched in my body, or somebody popped the lid off of an aspect of my being that was supposed to remain closed or maybe not supposed to be opened that quickly. And I went from never having a panic attack in my life to having 5 or 6 panic attacks a day, 5 days a week or more. And this lasted for probably 6 months. And at the time, I didn't understand what was happening to me. It took me probably a solid month and a half to realize that what I was having were panic attacks. Because if anybody's had a panic attack, you know that it's a very somatic experience. I never knew that a panic attack does not usually come from your conscious thoughts. I'm sure it can come from that, but mine was all somatic. And there was an aspect to what I was experiencing that was beyond the level of just having a nervous breakdown, beyond just suddenly having a lot of panic attacks. It was coupled with taking too many psychedelics. And what can happen sometimes, if you overdo it with psychedelics, is you essentially open yourself up to your own unconscious, or you open yourself up to the collective unconscious too rapidly. And this can trigger a state of spiritual crisis or spiritual emergency. And spiritual emergency can look like a lot of different things, but the way it was manifesting for me was essentially my incredibly repressed and split off shadow, unconscious material, buried trauma and pain, all of that flooding to the surface at one time with the inability to shut it off or even numb myself to it, distract myself from it, or to even tend to it. It was like a flooding of unconscious material. And because I grew up in Mormonism, that environment is very black and white. It's very rigid. There is no fluidity in the ego structure. It's like, this is who you are. This is what's right. This is what's wrong. And if you're not those things, if you don't line up with that, you literally cannot be saved in exaltation with your family. So learning this through childhood and throughout my life, it caused me to develop a really, really rigid ego structure that was guarding with my life whatever was happening in my unconscious, because the ego structure had to protect against those things because they were associated with Satan or with being bad or with not being with my family forever or whatever it might be. So it feels very life and death. It felt like the existential fate of my soul for eternity depended on keeping this stuff down, keeping it away. And so then all of a sudden, it started to come to the surface all at once. And the way that it was manifesting, because I grew up in such a Christian environment that focused so much on good and evil, my shadow material, my unconscious, was manifesting as demons. It felt very demonic. It was just terror and horror, which is why I was repeatedly having these panic attacks over and over and over again. But there was even more that was happening than just my unconscious material surfacing. There was even more than whatever Mormonism gave me and my own personal traumas and pains. If anybody is familiar with Stan Groff or has read any of his work, he is the founder of the Spiritual Emergence, or maybe it's Spiritual Emergency Network. He also started holotropic breathwork. He was colleagues with Ram Dass. He kind of is from that time. He's still alive, I believe, but he did a ton of research around psychedelics, and his whole theory is basically about birth trauma, which I won't go into all of this, but he talks about how his theory is basically that when we have really intense experiences in psychedelics, we are trying to reconcile or relive our birth trauma to work through that. And that like a lot of our greatest fears and deepest, darkest terrors and horrors come from the actual experience of being birthed, like of coming from that place of wholeness, union with the mother or union with whatever comes before that, and then entering a state of separateness. It's quite fascinating. But he also talks a lot about this process of like death and rebirth that is supposed to occur or that is trying to occur in our psychedelic experiences. And this is obviously not exclusive to him. Any sort of spiritual path will tell you about death and rebirth. But he talks about how if you begin this process in a psychedelic state and it does not fully resolve, that after effects or ripples can continue to occur after the psychedelic experience is over. It's almost as if the unconscious is trying to complete something. And when I read this, I knew that this was what I was experiencing. I knew that there was some sort of death rebirth process that began when I did all of the psychedelics that was now trying to finish, even though I was sober, even though I was just living my life. So it felt as if I was looping in the experience of death over and over and over again. Like if anyone has died on psychedelics, like if you've taken ayahuasca and you die, if you know that feeling of ego death, it was like that, but just all day, every day for months. I don't think I had one day for probably 2 years that I didn't think that that was going to be the day that I died. I was sleeping with my house unlocked because I needed people to be able to come in and find me if I died in my sleep. I took the password off my phone because I needed my kids to be able to call somebody if they found me. I was mourning the loss of my children. I was getting my will arranged. Every day felt like my last day. I kept thinking that I was just having a nervous breakdown, but the more that I looked at the symptoms of a nervous breakdown, and the more that I even talked to like therapists about this, I was not classically matching the symptoms of nervous breakdown. The solution was not just getting psychiatric help. I was in a process that felt much more like an initiation. I needed spiritual perspectives, which was the last thing on earth that I wanted at that time because I had just left Mormonism. I didn't want to do anything woo. I didn't want to be involved in some sort of weird thing that happened after I took psychedelics. I just wanted to be a normal human being. But the only people I could find who could really put words to what I was experiencing were people who were Buddhists, talking about hell realms, talking about the bardos, talking about Kundalini awakening, however you want to say it, or people who were in plant medicine spaces, or people who really understood Jungian psychology and the shadow. And so by the time I found Stan's book, I just cried. There was 3 of them that I read of his. There was The Way of the Psychonaut, Volume 1 and 2, and then Spiritual Emergency. And I just sobbed through reading those because he was speaking directly to what I was feeling. And so during this time, as I'm in extreme chaos, I couldn't eat. I started having functional seizures, which is basically a type of seizure where the nervous system is so overwhelmed and overloaded that it has like this release mechanism to release too much pressure that comes out as this sort of seizure. I got down to 95 pounds. I couldn't work. I had to move back in with my parents for a little while. I was non-functioning. If I had still believed in Satan or hell or actual dark spirits at that point, I would have thought that I was in some sort of possession. I would have thought that I opened myself up to dark spirits, because we all know Christians are all about protecting themselves against the dark spirits. I would have thought that I had somehow let them in through psychedelics and that I had now been overcome and overtaken. That's how it felt. And another indication that I was going through something that was much more existential rather than just like a mental health issue were my nightmares. And many of these nightmares were about Mormonism. And I want to take a minute just to tell you a few of these because the imagery is so intense, but it deeply speaks to me. The only way I can describe the nightmares that I was repeatedly having during this time is that they felt very demonic. It wasn't scary, somebody breaking into my house and trying to kill me kind of nightmare. It was encountering dark spirits kind of nightmare. And they were so intense that I would have to wake up and run to the bathroom because I was going to throw up. In one of them, I was inside of the Mormon church that I grew up in, and there were a bunch of men that were about to give someone a blessing to set them apart for a calling. And for anyone who's not familiar, that's basically like you get called to be a bishop or called to be some sort of leader in the church, hold some sort of position of authority. And in order to do that, they have to put their hands on your head. The men have to put their hands on your head and set you apart, meaning say a specific prayer that then grants you the keys. It's like a ritual, right? It's a religious ritual. It gives you the keys to then hold this calling. So I'm in this church and they're about to set someone apart for a calling. And they usually do it in the bishop's office or just a random empty classroom. And they're inviting me to come in with them. They're like, you have to come in. It's going to be really wonderful. And I felt really, really scared. I knew that something really bad was about to happen. And I was like, no, thank you. I do not want to go in there. And they kept persisting. They were very persuasive. And they're essentially just ushering me in there. Like, you have to come. You have to come. So I reluctantly go in and I sit down in the chair. And I don't want to watch. So I cover my eyes, I'm plugging my ears, I'm hiding my face because I know that something really bad is about to happen. And they all put their hands on his head to give him this blessing, and then they break his neck and they kill him. And then I start to run out of the church. I'm fleeing, and then they're chasing after me, trying to explain to me that this is normal. This is part of the ritual. This is part of our tradition. It kind of reminds me of Midsummer. Did anybody see that movie? Where they're doing these horrific things and then everybody in the cult is essentially like, this is okay. This is what we do. This is normal. In another dream, I was in a Mormon church again, but this time I was locked as a prisoner. And I had been there for so long that I was emaciated, completely neglected, basically just a skeleton. And I didn't have any skin. I didn't have any hair. And I was completely, almost like a shadow figure. And I'm locked inside of this Mormon church. And then standing outside are just 2 average Mormon men standing guard, like your bishop and your elders quorum president. They're just standing there shooting the shit, holding the keys, like tossing the keys up in the air, laughing, just making casual conversation while I have been locked in this church for who knows how long, just abused and destroyed. In another one, there were a bunch of men that were sitting in a room that they thought was safe, but inside of the room there was some sort of chemical that had been released into the air that was causing them to hallucinate. And they feel like they're safe inside of this room, but the reality is the room is about to be flooded with water, like they're about to drown. And there's a window where they can escape, but they can't see it because they're hallucinating on whatever this chemical is in the room. And they're sitting on these couches about to drown, hallucinating, and they're just picking up pieces of glass and eating this glass and just bleeding from their mouths, which this dream very much reminds me of the sacrament, right? Like taking the sacrament. And the last one that I'll tell you about is another one where I was in a Mormon church and I was watching this woman who was laying on the ground on her back. And there were two men that were stepping over her body repeatedly, back and forth and back and forth. And she was laying there just with her eyes closed. And then once they finish, she gets up and it's implied that she was put in some sort of trance, like they were doing some sort of ritual over her to put her in a trance. And she stands up, she runs over to me, she's so excited. She says, "Will you come with me? We're going to go into the basement. We're going to do a seance." She's like, "We're going to summon demons. You have to come. It's going to be so much fun." So at this point, it's like slow-mo. She's grabbing my hand. She turns back to look at me. Her hair like blows around. She's basically skipping, pulling my hand to the basement in slow-mo. And there's just this feeling of evil. The closer we get to the stairs, the more my body is like, no, 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 no. I cannot go into the basement of a Mormon church to do a seance. She starts pulling me down the stairs. We're halfway down the stairs and my whole system is like, this, I can't do this. So I stop her and I say, "I can't do this. I can't go with you." And she says, "No, you have to. Please, 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 please." I look at her and I say, "Do you know what those men were doing to you? Do you have any idea what they were doing to you back there?" Trying to get her to see that she had been put under some sort of spell. And she looks at me in the eyes and she starts to blink and I can see that she's starting to come out of it. She's starting to remember. She's starting to realize what had happened to her. And then I look at her again and she's been scalped. And all this blood is just dripping down her face. And then I wake up. Welcome to my shadow, you guys. Or I should say, welcome to the shadow of Mormonism. These dreams are all very demonic and very symbolic. It felt as if I was not only experiencing my own shadow that was overwhelming me, but that I was experiencing the collective shadow of Mormonism. Everything that Mormonism actually was that I couldn't see when I was in it, the evil side of Mormonism that's based in power and control and greed and manipulation, that was all coming up in my dreams. The way that my body had internalized all of that, because I wasn't recognizing it on the surface, I wasn't processing it on the surface, my body was holding it. And now it was coming up all at once. So during the day, I was having repeated panic attacks and in a constant state of terror. And then at night, having these nightmares. And the last piece to this puzzle that has taken me a really long time to piece together, to fully be able to put words to, is that it completely decimated my boundaries. This is another thing that can happen with psychedelics is they open you up too much too quickly, which, like I said, can open you up to your own unconscious material, but also makes it really difficult to separate yourself from what is yours and what is not. So during this time, the line between me and other people disappeared. The suffering that was happening out there felt like suffering in here. I couldn't distinguish between what was mine and what was collective. I never knew, what is this trauma that's surfacing? Is this something from my past? What is this thing that I'm feeling? Is this mine or is this someone else's? Is this the collective? I spent hours and hours and days and months just sobbing and sobbing and sobbing over what was happening in the world. And during this time, I'm trying to go to therapy, and therapists are always trying to get you to find your safe space, right? My therapists are always trying to get me to realize that I'm actually safe. They're like, "But you are safe. See, you're in your house. You have a job. Like, you're safe right now." And I was like, I don't care. It doesn't matter if I'm safe because other people are not. This isn't about me recognizing that I'm safe. This is about me trying to reconcile the fact that any of this shit that's happening on the planet is happening at all. I couldn't go back to feeling like I am separate. That's what I did in Mormonism. Like, oh, I'm safe here. Those people over there are having a real hard time, but that's not me because I'm over here. And it wasn't because I felt responsible for other people's pain. It wasn't because I somehow had a savior complex or I wanted to, change the world or I felt like I had to take all this on. None of that was happening. It was purely happening in my body. My physical body was showing me, you think you are separate from the world? You're not. What is happening out there is happening to you. What we do to each other, we do to ourselves. What we do to the planet, we do to ourselves. The constructs that we have that make us feel like we're separate, whether it be our privilege, our religions, our money, our race, the country that we live in, our political affiliations, all of those constructs are simply mental beliefs that make you believe that you are somehow disconnected from what's happening. It's just like how I left Mormonism and felt like I entered the world. All that was a mental construct that was making me believe I was separate. And now, my body was showing me in a visceral way, there is no separation. You can no longer pretend that you are somehow not a part of the same humanity that is suffering. And because I didn't have the language to understand or explain or even know what was happening to me until afterwards, until several years later, I was experiencing this firsthand. It didn't feel like I was looking at someone out there and saying, oh, that's so sad that they're going through that, like I did when I was in Mormonism. It felt like it was coming through my body. I don't know why it happened this way. I don't know why this strange, bizarre thing happened to me with psychedelics, but it felt as if they were saying, as if the mushrooms, as if the earth itself was saying to me, you need to see this. You need to see this. And in Mormonism, there's so much focus on the light, so much focus on protect against the darkness, protect against the pain, protect against the suffering. Don't look there. It's only light and love and joy and peace and laughter and harmony. But in all of my quote-unquote spiritual, joy-filled, beautiful experiences inside of Mormonism, nothing has ever impacted me more and permanently changed me more than this direct experience with the shadow. It was not heaven that changed me. It was hell. It was going through hell in my own body. It was feeling the hell that other people are going through. It was no longer being able to hold on to the illusion that I was somehow not a part of the hell that is happening here on earth. That is what permanently changed me. And in Mormonism, they do themselves such a disservice by shielding themselves from the world, by trying to keep themselves separate from humanity. Because the deeper you go inside of yourself, the deeper the love you feel. They call it depth for a reason. They call it depth of love. How deep of love can you feel? That is directly related to how deep you go in yourself. And the deeper you go in yourself, that's where you find the shadow. That's where you find the darkness. That's where you encounter the pain. Not just your own pain, but the collective pain of being a human being. The collective pain of humanity throughout all of time. That's where you find that. And feeling that. And not looking away, but looking at it and then saying, I still choose to be here. Not because I'm separate and protected, but because I am a part of this. I am a part of this humanity that is suffering. I still choose to love. I still choose to keep my heart open. That requires such a bigger heart. That requires so much more stretching. Loving the light is easy. Loving the darkness requires you to break open. And when you do, when you allow yourself to face it and not turn away and feel the grief that's there and feel the pain that's there, you encounter the deepest form of love. And I just speak to this from personal experience. The love that I felt in Mormonism was beautiful. It was great. It was very genuine. But in a sense, it was very childlike because it had never fully grown up. I had not fully grown up. You can't fully grow up unless you look at what's actually here. You see what's actually happening. You see what's actually inside of you. You can't fully grow up when you're pretending. And I would not have said this at the time. I hate this whole thing, this narrative that's like, this horrific thing that you're going through is going to be for your benefit. I think that is, most of the time, I'm like, I could never say that to someone else. That's something that each individual can decide for themselves. But for me personally, I have gotten to a place now where I can see that it was medicine. The people giving me too many psychedelics and mixing things and Mormonism doing what it did and all of the things that added up to me encountering the shadow and the darkness and the pain and the suffering in the way that I did, it was all medicine. Because it's something I can never unsee, something I can never unknow, and it will permanently shape how I live for the rest of my life. And the biggest thing I think about really connecting to your own humanity and connecting to your empathy is that it will move you to some type of change. I was talking to a friend once and she said this. She was talking about how Mormons often say they have empathy, but it's like, can you really call it empathy if it's not moving you to some sort of change? So connecting to my humanity and my empathy this way has really changed my focus from how can I heal and grow so that I can live my best life and follow my dreams and do all the things that I want, into how can I heal so that I can help? Because in this whole process, the entire time I kept thinking, if I didn't have a roof over my head, if I didn't have food, if I didn't have a stable income, if I didn't have support from people around me, I would have not made it. So there's not one part of me that doesn't recognize that there are people out there who do not have the means to help themselves in their current situation. The line between people who are psychologically well and those who are not is razor thin. The line between people who are financially stable and those who are not is razor thin. So as people who have the means, if we have the means to heal, we have to do it not just for ourselves. We have to do it so that we can help. And there is a certain extent of, you can't save people from their suffering. But in the same breath, what we do to each other, we do to ourselves. And when we help each other, when we help the collective, it directly affects all of us. This episode was a little more intense, you guys. And I want to say one more thing before I go. It's about Tom Cruise. And what I want to tell you is that going back to dream analysis, I had a lot of dreams during this time about Tom Cruise. And in Jungian dream analysis, which I would highly recommend getting into if you're not into it already, they focus a lot on associations, meaning two people could dream about Tom Cruise, and it could mean two completely different things to each of those individuals, depending on what they associate Tom Cruise with. So you might ask one person, what does Tom Cruise mean to you? And they'd be like, oh, heartthrob, like 90s movie star, whatever. But for me, Tom Cruise, when I really sat and thought about it, I was like, well, he's a narcissist and he's in a cult. So, when I dream about Tom Cruise, I'm dreaming about Mormonism. Tom Cruise is showing up in my dreams symbolizing Mormonism. Is that not incredible? Sometimes I swear the psyche is just like one giant joke, right? It's just like playing with you. And so I had so many dreams that were deeply symbolic around Mormonism, but they were showing up as Tom Cruise, like doing Tom Cruise things, like trying to save people and running around and doing whatever Tom Cruise does. Which was a nice break between my horrific nightmares that I was having. Okay, once again, thank you for listening. If you guys want more of my content, you can find me on Instagram or TikTok under Stephanie Ann again. Until next time.